This is GARIS Masculist MGTOW flyers, that is 2-3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 390, entitled Monoconscious Media Bias. Description. This flyer states that masculist theory has crystallized, so that the time is right for these ideas to be taken to the masses via the media people. But the problem is that the media people are so monoconsciously biased in favour of feminism that they're not open to masculist ideas. This flyer suggests ways on how this uphill battle of the masculists can be won. Now the flyer itself. Monoconscious Media Bias by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. What do I mean by the title of this flyer? Monoconsciousness means having only one consciousness raised, that is, usually one's feminist consciousness, which usually results in women becoming angry at men for the ways that men oppress women. So monoconscious feminists tend to be rather feminazi bitchy, with a surly, suspicious, negative attitude towards men, which makes such women rather unapproachable by men. So men tend to ignore such women, which is not what young women want, since they are biologically driven, biologically evolved to want to have babies. And a woman will have a very difficult time being both a time-committed careerist and a mother of very small children at the same time. So of necessity, and for reasons of practicality, she'll go looking for some gullible man-slave to work for her, so that she can live in a middle-class house raising her kids and have him pay for it all. Monoconscious feminists, by definition, know nothing about masculism, that is, men's lib. So through total ignorance of how women oppress men, they unconsciously think that gender oppression is a one-way street, that is, perpetuated by men against women, and that is all they have heard all their lives, with no single exception all that time. So naturally, they do not question the idea that it is men who gender oppress women. Not only are women like this, but so are men, since for the same reason they too have grown up hearing only the feminist message, that it is men who are the gender oppressors, that it is only women who are the victims of gender oppression. So it follows from this that if a male journalist hears some masculist for the first time in his life complaining at how women oppress men, and even claiming that in fact women oppress men far worse than vice versa, then such a confrontation with a masculist for the first time in the male journalist's life could only generate in him an experience of cognitive dissonance, that is, the extremely uncomfortable feeling when one has one's core beliefs seriously challenged. It's like going up to some fanatical Islamist and saying to him that modern scholarship is showing that Muhammad did not precede the Arab conquest of the Middle East, North Africa, and Spain, but rather followed that conquest, that for 2 centuries there's no record of Muhammad between the time of his death and the first written records of him. The average Islamist is spoon-fed the standard story of Muhammad, the so-called founder of the Islamist religion, from birth, and all his life is told the same standard story of Muhammad over and over. So hearing nothing to the contrary, of course he believes it. Then along come cynically minded Western scholar historians who look into the standard Mohammedan story and find that it doesn't hold water, that there are too many holes in the story, and that it is much more likely that Mohammedism was manufactured by a conquering political leader who needed a unified religion for his kingdom, in the same kind of way that Constantine, the Roman emperor, needed Christianity for his kingdom to unify his people. A lifetime of brainwashing is a very powerful thing. It controls the mind. It filters out contrary beliefs that may initially challenge what one has believed all one's life. If everyone around you believes the same, then only the most courageous and individualist of thinkers have the intellectual force to follow the evidential trail to where it leads, even if the final conclusion runs utterly contrary to what one has believed all one's life. I believe that something similar to the above has happened with feminism. A generation of young women has been brought up on feminist ideas, believing such things as equality between the sexes, equal abilities between the sexes, anything a man can do, a woman can do. The only reason why women have not performed as well as men is because of the male prejudice towards women, holding them back from their full potential, and the like. Young women have been thrust into the traditional male role of being a careerist, due largely to their mothers, who were the creators of second-wave feminism that pushed for social and legal equality for women, e.g. equal pay for equal work, equal access to the professions, the right to terminate an unwanted pregnancy, the right to get out of a bad marriage, etc. Young women's mothers lived through the era that included the invention of the contraceptive pill. That was the greatest social revolution of all time, since it allowed women for the first time in history to be able to control reliably the number of children they wanted. And since raising a kid in the modern industrialized world is so incredibly expensive, in brackets, for example, $250,000 per kid in the US today, these women chose to have only 0, 1 or 2 kids in most cases, and hence had a career window of half a century before they died. So inevitably, millions of women streamed into the workforce, earning their own money, becoming FIPs, that's financially independent persons, to a large extent, but not enough for the masculists, but more on that later. Thus women were thrust by the pill into a role that they were not evolved for. Women evolved to be baby factories and childminders, often of a dozen kids, so looking after them at home after the Industrial Revolution forced the creation of the nuclear family was a full-time job, while her husband was out the door earning the living to keep the whole family alive by providing the money to buy the food and pay the rent so that the next generation could survive into adulthood to repeat the generational cycle. With millions of women thrust into the career-oriented lifestyle of the man, women absorbed the self-image of being a careerist, of thinking like a man, being like a man, acting like a man, to the extent that more traditional men did not like having to work with women, having to compete with women for promotion in the workplace. Naturally, women reacted negatively and sought political help to create new feminist-based laws that gave women more opportunities to expand their self-image as female careerists. Feminist ideas and values have thus infiltrated throughout society, in the home as well as the workplace. Unfortunately for women, they did not have their masculist consciousness raised at the same time, so tended to be traditional in their expectations of men with regard to their female demands in the workplace. This ambiguity, from the perspective of the masculists, created real hypocrisies in women. For example, in the divorce courts, where women wanted the best of both worlds, that is, they wanted the right to get out of bad marriages, so made new divorce laws based on feminist principles of being able to dump a bad husband from the wife's perspective, but still expected that now ex-husband to continue to pay for her as a traditional financially dependent wife. It's in the divorce courts that the main thrust behind masculist thinking has arisen due to the massive injustices against men that have been committed in them. The masculists complain bitterly about the hypocrisies of feministed women who want equal rights for women in the parliaments but act as traditional financially dependent women, in brackets, fluffies, masculists call them, in the divorce courts, rejecting the idea that women should not only expect equal rights with men, but expect equal obligations with men as well, namely in sharing up the burden of earning the living by bothering to get a career-competent education that allows a woman to become a FIP, financially independent person, thus pulling her weight financially, not expecting to be able to parasite off the money and labour of a man. Masculists see monoconscious feminists as monsters, callous, insensitive monsters who had no understanding of how men are oppressed by hypocritical, fluffy feminists who oppress men for decades and continuously. The masculists claim that women are the far greater oppressors of men compared to vice versa, since women's oppression of men lasts such a long time, is relentless, and is largely unconscious, certainly in the minds of the fluffy feminists and most women in the divorce courts who know nothing about masculism and masculist ideas. Thus there is a real frustration, in capitals, and need on the part of the masculists to educate society about these problems. Masculists feel that both sexes need to be educated into how massively women oppress men with their many gender crimes against men. For example, most women see men as existing on this earth to pay for women to have babies. This attitude is deeply ingrained in women, and certainly most feminists. It's against this attitude that the masculists are fighting, aiming to crush this attitude, since a fluffy can only be a fluffy if she can get her financial claws into some gullible manslave who has been brainwashed all his life that his role in life is to be a manslave to a woman, a fluffy parasite, who expects that he will work for her so that she can raise her kids in the house that he pays for. Then, when she gets bored with him a decade later, she can go to the fluffy feminist-dominated divorce court system and get full custody of the kids from him with a 90% probability, get his house that he paid for, get child support from him, get half his stuff, and if she's a real fluffy parasite, even be paid alimony by him for the rest of her parasitic life. This massive injustice is happening to a quarter of fathers, so it is not surprising that a men's lib movement has formed that is lashing out at these massive gender injustices, and that masculist theorists are pushing hard for the restructuring of the gender roles so that they are much fairer to men. Otherwise, men will become so angry and hateful that there will be a sex war, in which thousands of fluffy feminist divorce lawyers and judges will be murdered as men snap, pick up arms and go on a gender political murdering spree to right the massive gender crimes committed against them. Masculists point out the many gender crimes that women commit against men, besides the most obvious one of manslaving men by not bothering to fip up, to become fips as adults, pulling their own financial weight, by not expecting to be a fluffy as an adult, expecting that some gullible, ignorant manslave will work for her. Women commit massive gender crimes against men that are continuous and last for decades. For example, paternity fraud, where in about 5% of pregnancies the husband is not the father, so the husband is paying for decades for a kid that is not his. This is obviously a major gender crime against which the gender crimes that men commit against women, in most cases, pale in comparison. Another major gender crime committed by women against men is pill lying, where the woman lies to her boyfriend/husband that she's taking the pill, whereas in reality she really wants to get pregnant and expects that her manslave will pay for the kid she wants that he does not want. That is, she expects him to work for this kid for decades, manslaving him for decades. Thus is a major decades-long gender crime. It's to stop gender crimes such as the above that the masculist theorists are pushing for the legislation of the paternity rejection right, so that men are not forced into paying for kids they don't want. The fact that women have the legislated maternity rejection right, commonly known as the abortion right, is the most blatant form of sexual discrimination that exists, and it's not against women, but against men, who women see as manslaves to women, who exist to pay for women to have babies. You can see why masculists are so angry and frustrated that their message is not getting out, other than via individual masculist websites, such as this one, in the way that the second wave feminist message got out in the late 60s and 70s. Masculists are certainly making their internet videos and spreading them across the planet, and this is making some impact, millions of men and smaller numbers of women are being exposed to these masculist ideas, so the tide is beginning to turn. But what is really lacking is a large-scale, mainstream media commitment to masculist ideas, so that these ideas can be spread to the masses, the millions, so that ordinary people can be exposed to them and be influenced by them, so that millions of people can then start pushing for the changes in gender political legislation that affect men, particularly reform in the divorce laws that will give men joint custody of kids by default, throwing out alimony, no halving of economic assets between the two divorcing parties, expecting women to FIP up so that schools and parents educate their daughters to be FIPs or expect to be punished by men and society for being hated fluffy parasites, to be treated as pariahs, utterly rejected by men and by society. This is the end of part 1.